You may have heard about the controversy surrounding Queen Cleopatra, Netflix's new film produced by Jada Pinkett Smith and starring Adele James as the lead, ultimately depicting the Egyptian ruler as a Black woman. However, if you haven't heard about the controversies, the hot takes either claim her as Macedonian, Greek, Egyptian, or simply African, as well as some overlapping theories, all of which reflect modern, 17th century and later interpretations of race, rather than how race was understood at the time of Cleopatra's reign. Today's guest is here to help us have a more nuanced conversation about this situation, and indeed this phenomenon that takes place more often than we may know. King is an Egyptian reconstructionist who takes critical looks at the ancient culture through the lens of their art. His YouTube channel, The King's Monologue, and subsequent social media accounts have garnered millions of impressions globally and allowed him to share his research with those interested in Egyptian history. Andrew Ade King is an independent historical researcher and CGI construction artist, and he joins us from London, England. This is the Black Information Network Daily Podcast, and I'm your host, Ramses Ja. All right, Andrew Ade King, welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
I'm really good. Thank you very much. And thanks for that introduction.
Of course, man. You're kind of a big deal around here. So, and your work, of course, your work is well appreciated and well received. So I'm happy to share it with our listeners today. So let's start at the beginning. Why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and sort of what led you to creating the King's Monologue?
Yeah, thanks. So basically, I've been into my history for about 20 years now. I think it started about 20 years ago. I bought a book by Sheikh Anta Diop called The African Origins of Civilization, where he essentially provides the evidence to suggest that the history of ancient Egypt was an African civilization, and it wasn't something that was, Mediterranean like had been sold. So, you know what it's like growing up in, Western society. I grew up obviously in London. I was schooled in London. You go to primary school and high school, and history is something that is very much whitewashed. It's very much kind of, you don't see a representation of what African or melanated people look like in what we're taught. So we, from a very young age, learn to disconnect ourselves from history and learn to kind of accept that we didn't really have a history, and the only kind of exposure or our most recent advent in history was kind of from the slave trade onwards. Before then, we were just kind of, these disparate tribal society. Sure. And when I looked into that book and when I learned about my history, are we okay with the audio?
Mm.
Sorry, good. Great. Sorry. So when I looked into that book and started learning about African history, I found it astounding. And obviously I found it very empowering, and it's almost like a can of worms, because you start off with ancient Egyptian history, and then you quickly learn to realize that actually we have, as melanated people, sometimes I say African, but sometimes I say melanated, because actually, as people of our skin tone, people who have been classified as Black, we're indigenous to pretty much every continent on the planet and have some kind of historical imprint that affects every continent on the planet. Sure. So it's it fast kind of evolves. But in starting the King's Monologue, I think that was at the tail end of lots of kind of experiments that I had done. So I remember maybe about 10 years ago, I started a Facebook page called Ancient Kemet, the Egypt They Never Showed You. And the focus of that page was just basically me finding images of the ancient Egyptians and showing people what they look like, because a lot of people don't know what they look like. They rely on reproductions, they rely on illustrations that are in our textbooks, but they're not the real images of the ancient Egyptians. So when you show them, look, here's the statues, here's how they portrayed themselves, that in itself carries enough weight. So I started this group where I just literally would just show images of the ancient Egyptians, what they look like, and that grew really fast. So that group's still going now. I haven't done anything in there for years and years, but it's got about 60,000 members in that group. And they are dedicated, they're on there every day. So that was really good. And then more recently, I started the King's Monologue, as you know. And I think what prompted me starting the King's Monologue was kind of the advent of AI, to be honest with you, because it was almost a coalition of different coincidences that came together. I've got a background in, photography. I'm a qualified teacher, by the way. That's just kind of on the side, something that I've always been very passionate about teaching, in, you know, in whatever kind of propensity it is. But when it came to the King's Monologue, what happened is AI came out, and I realized that I could kind of combine that with my skill that I've got in, you know, Photoshop, retouching, photography. I've done like many years kind of in that industry. And I was able to use kind of approximation techniques using AI software, and then kind of combine it with my skill of retouching to actually start to bring very, very lifelike reconstructions. And I found it quite powerful because I did it for myself therapeutically, first of all. And I was like, this is great. It feels I could connect with these, you know, as opposed to just having the statues, where we've almost been trained. I feel like we've been trained to not see ourselves in the statues. We've been trained to expect a certain kind of, I mean, I could go off on a bit of a rant here, but I think when people look back in time, you know, go back 1,000 years, we have got this kind of automatic mindset that suggests that all black people were kind of this extreme form of black. And I know that sounds really weird, but it's kind of like we don't see ourselves unless we see a really broad nose, really big lips. It's like when people see the Olmec heads, they go, oh yeah, that's an African.
Yeah.
But then when you show them Tutankhamun's face, there's a disconnect for some reason, because it looks more normal, looks more like what you might see walking down the street in New York or London. Do you understand what I mean? So it's like they can't connect with that. They can only they think that all black people kind of looked like this extreme black, because they've got this view that black was here, white was here, and the reason we have all of this variance in, you know, within melanated people is because of mixing. Basically, racial mixing is where all variance comes from. Before then, there was no variety. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. That African phenotypic variety has always been there. So these reconstructions, I feel, kind of help people to connect, because they can start to see themselves in the statues again. They can start to see what they look like. And it's kind of like, oh, I can see it now. This is what Akhenaten looked like. This is what Tutankhamun looked like. So I started that. I started on TikTok, first of all. I put one post out, and it pretty much went viral straight away. Yeah, it just went crazy. So that one, I think, is sitting over 2 million views now. But most of those views were literally garnered in the first 48 hours. I think I had like 1.5 million views in 48 hours, and it went crazy. A lot of hate. I have to make that really clear. There are a lot of people who are indignant about the fact that people would draw a, you know, relationship between Africa and Egypt, even though Egypt's in Africa. Weird. People just, it's so weird. It is. And the amount of attacks that I get is actually, you know, astounding how much, you know, spam work I have to do. But on the other hand, obviously it's incredibly enlightening for people. So when I transferred that to YouTube, I wasn't expecting much traction, but the YouTube channel kind of blew up as well. So on my YouTube channel now, I think I'm sitting on about 3 million views across all of the videos that I've posted there. And that's been just over 2 months. I've just kind of been putting out that kind of content. So let's talk about the YouTube channel and the YouTube videos. What types of videos have you been putting up, or what are people learning from the different videos that you've been able to put up on your YouTube? Yes. So basically there's 2 forms of videos that I focus on. YouTube kind of has 2 platforms. It's got the long platform and the short platform. The short platform is the kind of material that I'll share on TikTok. You know, it's basically has to be under 1 minute. So I'll put out really short, informative posts. So I find with my shorts, I focus on cultural continuity. So I have posts like, you know, showing that, you know, Egyptian have the same, you know, ancient Egyptians wear the same hairstyles that we do today. So I've got this video called about the African short twist, which is the most popular hairstyle in ancient Egypt. It's pretty much on most of the statues of the villagers, lots of the statues of the noblemen. It's a very, very popular hairstyle. It's the same hairstyle that was used in ancient Benin. It's the same hairstyle that's used today in the Afar and the Aroma people. It's just used all over Africa, and it was used in ancient Egypt. So yeah, I've got that short, but then the long videos tend to be focused on actually focusing in on a one reconstruction at a time. So I'll kind of do a video about my Tutankhamun reconstruction. I'll take people through the process, because I have a very have quite a meticulous process in the way that I develop it. I don't want to develop my reconstructions with any form of bias. I don't want to try to make them look black, because I think that's something that we have to be conscious not to do. There's a very kind of common Eurocentric trait, and that is to try to Europeanize everything. That's very much a Eurocentric trait. So take things that have no business being associated with European people and force it into, you know, square peg into a, you know, into a round hole, force it, make it look European. And I'm not into that whatsoever. So I take several of the, you know, statues, as much kind of representation I can find of a certain character in ancient Egypt, and I approximate what their, you know, appearance would be based on all of these different artworks. Because unlike obviously modern Egyptologists, I am of the impression that ancient Egyptian artists were among the best in history, and they could make very, very realistic, you know, appearance or, you know, representations of what the ancient Egyptians looked like. So I use that as my kind of, that's my governing point.
Okay. You know, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I actually went to Egypt for my last birthday, and I was able to take in some of the art. So I know exactly what you're talking about when you look at some of those magnificent statues and you see the African features and the brilliance and the artistry of all of it.
Indeed.
I mean, we're used to seeing like the Sphinx and, you know, things like the Egyptian ruins, but some of the things that were like exceptionally well preserved, it's just, they're decidedly African, black-skinned African features in the artwork over there. And so I say that to say that I understand what it is you're talking about. But that brings me to my next point. So you mentioned some of the videos that you talked about. One such video that caught my eye and a lot of other people's eye is your video on Cleopatra. So before we get into Cleopatra too much, why not give us a brief history on her, and then sort of what you found out about how she was depicted and how she is being depicted?
Indeed. It's a really great topic, because I touch on this in the video itself. Cleopatra is almost like, you know, Egypt 101, kind of your starting point. Every time people, if you don't know about ancient Egypt, the first name that will probably come to your mind is Cleopatra. Right. And for that reason, her name has become kind of synonymous with a bit of a battleground, hasn't it? In terms of, like, you know, people of African descent will say, you know, Cleopatra was black. It's something that I used to say before I knew anything about ancient Egypt. Sure. And clearly we're seeing a lot of resistance from what's been done with the Netflix show, where, you know, people are kind of, you know, obviously people of European descent and the actual, you know, Egyptians who are there currently, they're kind of indignant at the fact that black people would even make a claim that Cleopatra was black. But in terms of my kind of view of Cleopatra, it's evolved. So like I said, I came from that school of she's black. But then when I got into, you know, ancient Egypt, and when I really started delving into the history, you understand that she was part of a colonizer class. Whether or not it was she was born into it, which she was, or if it was something that was taken by choice. The point is the Ptolemaic era, which is the rule of the Ptolemies. So the Ptolemies were the Greeks who basically invaded. And that's not the story you'll get from Eurocentrics. They'll say they kind of walked in and were welcomed. But however you want to put it, they colonized ancient Egypt. They took over ancient Egypt. They put their rulers in place. And all of the male rulers, or the kings, were called Ptolemy. And all of the female rulers, or the queens, were called Cleopatra. So the Cleopatra that we're talking about is Cleopatra the Seventh. And she was, you know, she was a ruler that, you know, came in after the Greek Empire had been there for, you know, 150 going on 200 years. And ancient Egyptian, you know, if you're talking about the actual indigenous ancient Egyptians, the Kemetics, they were pretty much, you know, they were wrapped up by then. You know, their kingdom had fallen. So she doesn't represent much. She doesn't really represent anything positive for someone who's really into ancient Egypt like I am. So I don't have a massive connection with her. And I think it's one of those things where even before this came out, it's kind of ground that I'm willing to concede, because it's like, I don't think it's that important in the context of what ancient Egypt was.
So, well, some of the things that I have found about Cleopatra that I believe people are talking about right now, and you correct me if I'm wrong or if any of this stuff is wrong. I'm just going to kind of fire off a few things. First is that she was born in Alexandria. So that makes her by birth Egyptian. She was born 69 BC, and her father was of Macedonian Greek ancestry. So this is what records show, historical records show, right? Yep. So this is part of the reason why many people are claiming that she was not Black, and the representation of her in the film was a misrepresentation. However, the pushback comes from her mother's side, because there's not a lot known about her mother, including her mother's ancestry. And so because of the fact that her mother's ancestry is in question, and then subsequent artistic depictions of the queen have allowed for this sort of pushback to suggest that, you know, this was a woman with African roots, African blood. And she is not being misrepresented in this film. So what are your thoughts on that sort of conversation that folks are having right now?
Yeah, I think her representation is spot on, if I'm going to be totally honest with you. You know, just on a really basic level, the Macedonians, in my impression, Macedonian Greeks, you know, we've got this view of what is white, what is Black. And it's almost like if it's not Black, it's white, or it's claimed as. Yeah. Exactly. It's kind of claimed as Caucasoid. If you're not, but you know, you and I both know there's so much nuance into what a Black person is. You can have someone who's really dark, really African features, and doesn't classify themselves as Black. You know, Cuba comes to mind. Sure. Dominican Republic, you know, comes to mind, where they'll say, no, I'm Latino, I'm not Black, you know. And then you get people who are incredibly fair skinned, and you wouldn't, and they would, no, I'm Black. So it's like Black is more of a political thing. So looking at the representation they have of Cleopatra, the first thing that I said when I saw her, and you can see this in the reaction video that I recorded, the first thing that I said when I saw her was like, she looks Egyptian. And I wasn't just saying that, like, you know, you've been to Egypt. You know that the kind of leading phenotype in Egypt is kind of this mixed race look. It's very much mixed race, but they view themselves as being Arab. They speak with an Arabic tongue, and it's almost like that phenotype is, once again, like I said earlier, you know, we're almost blinded to things that we see based on kind of perception, you know. So based on what we associate with the Arabic tongue, all of a sudden we no longer see the fact that this woman, if she was transported into America, would become Black. But if she put on a headscarf and started speaking Arabic, you would wholly accept her as an Egyptian woman. No doubt, you know. She's
well, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think
of course.
I think that what you're saying right now speaks to what we mentioned at the top of the show, is that race was understood very differently prior to the 17th century. Race is a very modern construct. And how we stratify societies, and how we assign a value to people and families and cultures is very different. If we're going by sort of a racial framework.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's kind of the point that you're making right there. It is,
yeah.
Yeah. Very
and I was going to commend you for that. The intro that you made, I actually forgot to mention that, because that was, it's exactly the way I see things. You know, race is this construct that was created in the 17th century. And before then, people didn't classify race. People maybe used complexion as a descriptor, but race was not a thing. You know, you were English, you could be dark, you could be swarthy, you could be tawny, you could be pale, you could be, you know, you could be all of these ranges. And what mattered was your geolocation. What mattered was where you're from, your geography. It wasn't your skin tone. And people definitely have a really hard time getting their mind around the fact that, you know, people of all skin tones existed in most nations for a pretty long time throughout human history. So going back to, talking about Cleopatra again, I saw her and instantly I thought, that's an Egyptian woman. So if we're going to talk about the representation, the Macedonians, the Greeks, they were not lily white people as they are being depicted by Hollywood. It's an impossibility of their location on the planet. Let's be totally honest with you. You know, if you're going to be in Egypt and be quite comfortable in the Egyptian sun, you're going to have a level of melanation that is beyond what you get in Northern Europe. So we know they don't look like that. And actually, if you look in the Fayum portraits, you get very detailed picture of what the Greeks and the Macedonians looked like. And they looked very much like modern Egyptians. They had that kind of North African, very much kind of biracial phenotype. That's what they were. So it's not surprising that when they found the, you know, remains of Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, who was a half sister, so we can't draw too much of a conclusion from that, but they said categorically that she was African. She had the kind of same elongated head that Africans have, the same kind of craniometrics. That is basically the actual words they use was, we only see this in Black Africans and ancient Egyptians. So that's literally what the research just said.
So,
and these are
right. So insofar as Hollywood is concerned, Cleopatra is closer to Adele James in terms of how her phenotype than Elizabeth Taylor, who played Cleopatra back in the 60s. And this was something that Black people pushed back against because that was a textbook example of whitewashing, insofar as Black Americans are concerned. And I'm sure Black Europeans are concerned as well. So,
absolutely.
So, yeah, interesting.
I mean, just to build on that as well, and this is something else I touched on in my reaction video, but there's a reason Cleopatra has been chosen. There's a reason why Cleopatra is the talking point, because that was very strategic. You know, if we talk about the Ptolemaic era, we are talking about an era where you have lots of European representation within the nation of Egypt. Whether or not, race aside, the fact of the matter is the Mediterranean were ruling Europe. And it's not a coincidence that now this has become the battleground for what ancient Egypt is, when it's not a representation of what ancient Egypt is. So the only reason we're talking about Cleopatra is because for a long time, Eurocentric Egyptologists, European media have been controlling the dialogue. If we were in control of the dialogue, we wouldn't even talk about Cleopatra. She's as relevant to ancient Egyptian history as, you know, George Washington is to, you know, ancient Mayan history. You know, she's not relevant to what the ancient Egyptians were. It's an era outside of their greatness. It's beyond it's beyond the point where ancient Egypt was a magnificent, you know, empire that the world looked upon and wanted to be like. This is now they've fallen. Now they've kind of been overruled by by Europe. And now all of a sudden, Cleopatra becomes this most important queen when you have so many other queens, Queen T, Hatshepsut, Amos Nefertari, Meritmut, Nefertiti, all of these African queens who have very African features and African statues and did amazing things in terms of what they were able to do, the reforms they brought, or if they were woman conquerors. All of these things are reflected throughout ancient Egyptian history. Lots and lots of queens, but we're focused in on this European queen. Or, you know, you said actually she was Egyptian. She was born in Alexandria, but she represented a European empire inside of Egypt. So it's not by accident that we're speaking about her and we're not speaking about the real Egyptian queens.
We are here today with Andrew Ade King, an independent historical researcher and CGI construction artist. Okay, so I'm glad you made that point. When I was in Egypt last year, I saw at the flood bank of the Nile River, there's a flood bank that goes right up to a temple where they would entomb the pharaoh's body. So when the Nile was in the flood season, it was the outer bank, I guess. There were some markings, hieroglyphics etched into a wall face. And our tour guide said, she pointed to one of them, and it was this symbol for Ra, I'm sorry. And the symbol, she said this symbol, this carving is 5,000 years old. The person 5,000 years ago etched that right there, among the other symbols, but that was one that was had stood the test of time. The rest were a little bit more faint. There was a deep gouge for the symbol of God or of Ra. So 5,000 years, right? And you mentioned the height of Egypt's greatness. I mentioned at the beginning that it's documented that Cleopatra, the one that we're talking about today, was born, I believe it was 65 BC, something like that, 69 BC. So we're talking about the height of the civilization perhaps being somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 years before Cleopatra was even born. And what it looks like to a person like me is maybe there is an opportunity by those Mediterranean folks, European folks, whoever, even Egyptian folks who want to be disconnected from their African history. There is an opportunity there for them to, through Cleopatra, co-opt all of Egypt's history, including the greatness, the height of the empire 3,000 years prior to Cleopatra's birth. And it's a way to push back against this narrative that Black people have achieved great things when indeed European people were still dealing with a lot. I don't want to be rude to my Caucasian brothers and sisters, but they were still kind of on their journey. So we'll say it that way. So I appreciate you saying
very diplomatic.
You say again?
That's a very diplomatic way to put it.
Yeah, you know how it is. So, and I mean that because, I don't think that, punching back and forth gets anybody anywhere. I'm a fan of the truth, and sometimes the truth sucks. And sometimes the truth is very, very healing. Sometimes you're dealt a blow here and there, and sometimes you realize, okay, well, and so my path has always kind of been best served by being diplomatic and not punching down when the narrative or indeed the facts support something that puts African people, Black people in the center of the conversation, which is something that is often very uncomfortable for non-Black people, in particular white men who are very conservative, at least in this country. I say that to say
not just in that country, over here as well.
But I say that to say that this is one thing that is very surprising to learn about on your channel. You know what I mean? This isn't comments. This is like a deep dive, scholarly assessment of it. But I do want people to not just walk away from this conversation knowing a little bit more about Cleopatra. I want people to walk away from this conversation knowing a bit more about your channel and the work that you're doing, and your social media outlets as well. So give us maybe one or two, if you can come up with two, additional like surprising things that you've uncovered researching the topics that you have on the King's Monologue, something that maybe you didn't know, or maybe other people find surprising.
Oh, there's quite a lot there. I'm not sure how far I should go. First of all, I just want to touch on one of the points that you made, because I think it was really pertinent point, because I think the point you made about the fact that, they're going to use this as an opportunity to almost discredit, the enlightening, for want of a better word, that's kind of taken place amongst, all people of the world, not just, people of, African ancestry and melanated people, but all people of the world, to the fact, their eyes are being opened to the fact that, different people have contributed to history. The origins of civilization actually aren't as clear cut and black and white, or I should say white and white, as what we've been, what we've been taught or what we've been raised. I think it's been very deliberate. I think this, well, I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist, I'm sorry, I have to be honest. I think it's a bit deliberate, the whole timing of this, because I think it is going to be used. It's almost like they're creating this, they're overreacting. It's a massive overreaction. We know this in terms of what's happening right now. And I can tell you that firsthand. My channel is being inundated right now with spammers and with kind of negative aggression that has just literally, multiplied, by several factors since the Cleopatra thing came out. So people are actually targeting, seeking out my channel now to spam it, to put negative comments on there, to, really just come at us. I'm seeing this term blackwashing being thrown around every other comment, and that the irony and the gaslighting of that, to people turn around and say we're blackwashing history, when we know that the opposite has been true for, at least 200 years.
I want to say something while we're here, and I know I have asked you a much bigger question, but for me, what frames everything is the fact that human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, started in Africa with black skin. It is irrefutable. It is scientific. And so there's an argument to be made that all musical history has roots to Africa. There's an argument to be made that all architectural history, all history in terms of mathematics, so forth and so on. You get what I'm saying? So please continue.
That point actually adds to the point I was about to make anyway. Please. So that was actually quite perfect, because I'm going to use that to answer your question about surprising things that have been uncovered. Please. The surprising things that have been uncovered that I touch on my channel is that actually, here's the most surprising thing. We have, when I say we, I mean people of melanated skin, have an imprint on pretty much every continent on the planet, but particularly Europe. And this is why you're getting such a big pushback, I believe. They recently revealed a reconstruction of Cheddar Man. I don't know if you've seen this. Cheddar Man was one of the first Brits. So he existed in England, I think 8,000 years ago, and they've done his reconstruction, and his reconstruction is very dark. When I say very dark, I mean slightly darker than my skin tone. Now, the reason they've done his reconstruction this dark is because they had no choice, because essentially they've done genetic testing on him, and he doesn't carry the gene that is specifically required for pale skin in modern Europeans. So there's a specific gene that kind of came into existence a few thousand years ago, which gives modern Europeans, all of them, their pale skin, or their fairer skin, I should say. And he lacks this gene. So if people lack this gene, then they know, complexion wise, they're going to be from dark to very dark, because they don't have the ability to be lighter than that, so to speak. So you see this with the reconstruction of Cheddar Man. So then it brings into question, okay, we know that the first Brits were dark skinned, Europeans or Africans, you can call them what you want, but they were dark skinned. And then we know a few thousand years later, we have the ivory bangle lady, who's the first Romans to settle in York. And we know that they were black as well. That was discovered several years ago, and you can literally Google that. So that's the ivory bangle lady. She kind of led the group of, Roman colonizers, so to speak, and they settled in York.
So she was black. Spell the names. You said the first one was
Cheddar Man. So the first one was Cheddar Man. You can
spell those Google names for our listeners. And then
cheddar, as in cheddar cheese.
Okay.
So yeah, CHEDDAR. So Cheddar Man. And the second one is the ivory bangle lady. So ivory, as in the bone. So ivory bangle lady. You can Google that as well. They've done reconstruction. So the more you dig into British history, the more you start to realize that actually there's a lot of melanation for want of a better word, in Britain's history. And then you start going throughout history and you start bringing up royals. And this is where it gets really interesting. There's a lot of British royals that we know now were melanated. And I touch on some of these in my channel as well. So the reason I touch on all of this is because it's creating a lot of fear. The fact that these things that have been hidden for so long are being uncovered, I think is creating a lot of fear. And so they're going to make major moves to kind of discredit anything that comes out. I'm labeled Afrocentric straight away. I'm very objective on my channel. I do things often that upset my black following, because I'll get a reconstruction and I'll make it lighter if I think it's accurate. I'll take a broad nose and I'll make it thinner. And these are things that people feel very uncomfortable about. I'll introduce phenotypes within reconstructions that people, start to feel uncomfortable because their minds are programmed in a certain way. But I just like you, I really do value objectivity and honesty. And I think that, the only way we're going to make progress is if we don't attack history the same way Eurocentrics have attacked history for the past, I don't know, for several hundred years, and just, completely lying and claiming cultures that aren't theirs. And we actually apply it honestly. And yeah, I think that's the answer to your question about what surprising things will they kind of find out. I think that one of the major answers is that you're going to find out beyond ancient Egypt that actually, several people, melanated people in particular, have massive imprints on several societies that you'd be really, really shocked to find out.
I want to share this with our listeners. I was making a note because I wanted to look up Cheddar Man, and I wanted to make sure that I would be able to speak intelligently about this. And so I made a note on my computer, and then it pulled up 2 Google results. The first two, the first is the Natural History Museum. The second one is from the BBC. And it says that the line on the second Google result, I just typed in Cheddar Man. Second line says DNA shows early Britain had dark skin, BBC. So I think that because a lot of times when you have these conversations with people, they're so Afrocentric, they're so black, pro-black rather, that it's like kind of it ends up being the phenomenon that we push back against. We're as we were establishing, we're fans of the truth, even if the truth is uncomfortable, right?
Absolutely.
But that commitment is sort of what keeps your channel credible, keeps this show credible. And there are lots of people who will kind of put a little extra on there. And so I'm glad to see that this Cheddar Man, indeed, the second result, BBC News, which in my estimation is among the most credible organizations.
We're not going to agree there.
Well, maybe not.
So
I better. I mean, no, in terms of European,
I cannot stand the BBC, honestly.
No, okay. Well,
yeah,
you know better than me. They've
been doing me dirty
this much. So, in terms of their credibility, insofar as something like this is concerned, then perhaps but it's not like someplace I've never heard of before. And this is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, credibility amongst the general public, they're right at the top. Right.
So that's what
I've got my reasons. Yeah, and I agree.
Yeah. I've actually been interviewed by the BBC before for some issue with a trademark and Kanye West and whatever, and they were very kind to me. So this is the only experience that I have with those guys. But I don't want to keep you too long. So I have another question for you before we let you go, and that is, what is it that you hope to accomplish with the King's Monologue long term?
It's a great question. I think for me personally, that when I started the channel, I'm going to be totally honest with you, I had no idea what to expect. But I know that one of my main drivers in life is to teach. Like I said, I'm a qualified teacher from the start. And I think, knowledge is really empowering. It's not just, powerful, it's actually empowering itself. And I think one of the biggest tools that has been used to create kind of underachievement, I'm going to use a very cliche teaching term here, underachievement amongst our youth and in society, is the fact that their history has been stolen. So, and this is, I've phrased it that way deliberately because I don't want to say they're not being taught their history. I'm going to say, the history has been actively stolen. And when you remove someone's history, achievement, greatness, exceptionalism becomes exceptionalism. So when you're doing something really good, it's like, oh wow, you're an exception. It's like, I'm sure you've heard it. You're very articulate for a black man. I mean, I know you've heard that statement before. I know for a fact. So things that should be standard become exceptional, when your history is removed. However, when people become aligned and realize, actually, look, there's a trail of greatness that precedes you. You come from great stock. And I battled with this less because I'm Nigerian, and my mum did a really good job of kind of like connecting me with my culture and our history. And Nigerians tend to do quite well in lots of societies. And I think part of it is that connection. So being able to kind of reconnect melanated people globally with their history is my main driving force. But I'm also seeing the side effect, which is, people who, aren't melanated, people who are, European, people who are white, people who are Asian. They're like, I'm so glad for what you're doing. I'm so sick of seeing these reconstructions that I know are false and being taught this false history. This just looks so much more authentic. So I think just being able to impact the world in that regard, if I look at what the channel's done already and I look at the amount of views, I'm thinking to myself, that's 6 million people globally who have now seen, an alternative reconstruction of, Tutankhamun or, Akhenaten or Nefertiti. That's pretty powerful stuff. So yeah, I think more of the same.
All right.
In terms of, yeah.
I can't wait till you do more on Ramses, because, that's my guy.
Yeah. I have to now, don't I?
Before we let you go, let's let everyone know how we can tap in with you. Of course, plug your YouTube channel, but all your social media and anything you got upcoming, websites, whatever, you name it. Let's make sure that everyone has what they need.
Oh, thank you. I have a Patreon. So obviously, if you want to support my work, you can, I think it's just King's Monologue. Most of my handles are King's Monologue. Obviously, the YouTube channel, please do, go on there, subscribe, check out the content. I have a TikTok, which is the King's Monologue, I think. And that's pretty active as well. I put all my shorts on there. And Twitter is at King's Monologue, and Instagram. If you want to message me, you're better off starting with Instagram. That's how we started, isn't it? So you're better off starting with Instagram. If you want to, get in contact with me and have a discussion, that's probably where I'll start, because there's nothing on YouTube for you to be able to get in contact with me.
Sure.
I think that's it. Yeah, that's it really.
All right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. And of course, I appreciate you. I appreciate this journey that you're on. It's meaningful to me, and obviously it's meaningful to a lot of people out there. So keep going. Whenever is the next step, come back on. Let's talk again. And yeah, let's keep the conversation going. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, today's guest is Andrew Ade King, independent historical researcher and CGI construction artist. And before I go, I'll leave you with this. If you're like me, African history is a very important part of your weekly content intake. I recommend checking out the King's Monologue on YouTube and all social media, subscribing, and taking a moment for the art and the historical depictions of our history. Because when we know our history, it informs our path toward the future. This has been a production of the Black Information Network. Today's show was produced by Chris Thompson. Have some thoughts you'd like to share? Use the red microphone talkback feature on the iHeartRadio app. While you're there, be sure to hit subscribe and download all of our episodes. I am your host, Ramses Ja, on all social media. And join us tomorrow as we share our news with our voice from our perspective, right here on the Black Information Network Daily Podcast.